look, I do wish everybody a very warm welcome, and from all over the world. It is a really significant participation of many, many countries. And to our meeting, which we have called an emergency online meeting. It's been called by the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, and it's titled "British Court Decision Puts Assange's Life in Danger, Demand His Immediate Release." My name is Cheryl Crisp, and I will be chairing tonight's meeting. Our two speakers tonight, one is from the United Kingdom, and we are very, very pleased that Thomas Scripps is able to participate in our meeting tonight. He will speak first, and then Oscar Grenfell from the SEP in Australia. Both of these comrades have written extensively on the World Socialist Web Site over much of the past, or more than a decade, on the ongoing persecution of Julian Assange and the fight to mobilise the working class in his defence. As I said, following their remarks, we will open the meeting to questions, answers and discussion. I'll just make a few points before introducing Tom. In April 2010, WikiLeaks released a video of classified US military footage. It revealed to a shocked and horrified world the wanton and indiscriminate murder of innocent, unarmed civilians, including two Reuters journalists. Walking in a Baghdad street, they were mowed down by a US Apache helicopter crew. For millions of ordinary people, the name WikiLeaks gave to the video, Collateral Murder, became synonymous with the exposure of hidden crimes of all governments, the secret and murderous actions of their military, the behind closed door deals and cover-ups of capitalist politicians of every political persuasion and nationality. It became synonymous with the truth. The response of governments in the US, the UK, Australia, to the reporting of that crime and many others was not concerned that the crimes had in fact happened, but that they had become the knowledge of ordinary people. Assange's Australian citizenship has meant absolutely nothing in terms of upholding his rights by any section of the political elite in this country, notwithstanding the latest whimperings from some of the MPs about the British court decision. The unbridled and naked hatred of the capitalist class toward the person of Julian Assange is because they understand the danger of knowledge, information, and the truth in the hands of the multi-million masses. Their aim has been to silence him and to demonstrate to anyone else that this is what will happen if you intend to follow his lead. The fact that the decision of the British courts on December the 10th to allow the US to undertake the extradition of Assange was taken in the midst of the worst health and political crisis for almost a century may have a degree of accident associated with it, but it is also profoundly lawful. The world is entering into the third year of the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 276.5 million people have been infected worldwide by the virus. More than 5.3 million are dead, and they're the official figures. In fact, with excess deaths, the estimated death toll is anything between 15 and 21 million. This time last year, we were told that with the end of 2020, we could look forward to 2021 as a return to normality because of the administration of vaccinations. Instead, more people have been infected and more have died this year than last. 2022 is heralding an upsurge of the virus in the form of the Omicron variant, the likes of which have not been seen since the outbreak of the pandemic. The virus is more infectious than Delta and the original strain, and because of its multiple mutations, is able to bypass vaccine efficacy. Infections are doubling every 2 days. The virus is spreading in populations which are double vaccinated, but the virus has rendered them effectively unprotected. The hospital systems in virtually every country are facing collapse and crumbling under the sheer weight of numbers. There is a rolling catastrophe developing which will maim and kill possibly millions of people. This was no act of nature. It wasn't an unavoidable event, but the outcome of conscious decisions of governments. But still, the lies and misinformation which has characterised the response of capitalist governments since January 2020 not just continues, but now reaches unsurpassed levels. Populations were told that COVID was just like the flu, that herd immunity would protect people, that children weren't affected by the virus, that it was the creation of the Chinese in the Wuhan lab, that vaccines alone would protect people, and then with Omicron, that it was milder and should be allowed to spread unchecked. Decisions were made which ensured the spread of the virus. Under the mantra of the cure can't be worse than the disease, Trump jettisoned all measures necessary to stop the spread of the virus. The current Biden administration has continued that policy, and let us remember that in 2010, then Vice President Biden to President Obama labelled Assange as a high-tech terrorist. And everybody knows what happens to terrorists. Boris Johnson in the US spat out, let the bodies pile high, no more lockdowns, and then declared Freedom Day, which has condemned millions of British people to infection, disease, and death. In Australia, the decision to dispense with the very effective measures which suppress the spread of the virus is opening up a disaster. And again, one has to know that the decisions of the Morrison government to implement those measures were not out of choice, but because of the demands of scientists, epidemiologists, and sections of the working class, teachers, healthcare workers, and others. Since August the 12th, 2021, which is 4 months, a little over 4 months, there has been an almost 7-fold increase in infection rates in this country, mainly centred in New South Wales, but spreading to most other states. And just to give you a sense of what these decisions that governments have made have created, for 8 months between November 2020 to July 2021, 3 people in Australia died of COVID-19 in this country. But that isn't the interest or the concern of business. Money, profit, and production is. And in response to the demands of business and major corporations, the Murdoch media, the Financial Times, who declared lockdowns and public health measures had to end, that never again could there be another lockdown, all measures which impinged on profits and wealth have been dispensed with. And this has been carried out by governments of Liberal and Labor persuasions. The federal government health spokesman, which quite frankly is a contradiction in terms, declared that the greatest Christmas present that could happen in this country would be the spread of Omicron to every single person. This was based on the proposition that Omicron is milder than Delta, a proposition for which there is no evidence to date. But that is precisely what they are doing. And the modelling from the Burnett Institute predicts that unchecked, if things continue as they are now, infections are on track to reach 200,000 cases a day by the end of January. For those of you who are wondering why in a meeting on the defence of Julian Assange, I'm discussing the pandemic, the reason and the point that I'm making is that the truth is a life and death question. And it is certainly under conditions of a crisis, that it becomes an immediate issue of life and death. Without the truth, ordinary people, the working class, the mass of the world's population are completely disarmed. But that is what has happened in the course of the last 2 years. And so the connection between the defence of Julian Assange, the defence of truth, and the decision of the World Socialist Web Site to launch the global workers' inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic is the fight for the development of knowledge, of information, of verifiable data, the truth, in order that people and ordinary people can make the decisions, informed decisions, which are necessary in order to protect society and protect the ability and develop the ability to fight for the end of the pandemic. The inquest will determine not just what has happened, but who made the decisions to allow it to happen. In whose interests were those decisions made? Why were they made? And who allowed them to be made? But most importantly, the inquest is part of the mobilisation of the working class to reveal the truth about what is the greatest crisis facing mankind for decades and generations, and to provide that truth to the social force, the only social force which can implement the necessary measures to end the pandemic. And that social force is the working class. And it is the same social force that must be mobilised in the defence of Julian Assange. No longer can there be faith placed in Parliament, in parliamentarians, in pressuring governments, in legal challenges. That has been done and it has failed. It is to the working class that the task, the responsibility and the fight for the defence of Julian Assange has to be undertaken. To speak on these issues and more tonight, as I said, is the first of our 2 speakers. Thomas Scripps, who is the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP in the United Kingdom, joined the party in 2012. And Tom has written extensively on the political situation in the United Kingdom and specifically on the plight of Julian Assange. He has been a central part of the fight of our British comrades to oppose that persecution and to bring to the attention of the British and international audience the fight for his release. On your behalf, I give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for that introduction. The fight against the pandemic is undoubtedly now inseparably connected with the fight to free Julian Assange. And thank you also to the Socialist Equality Party in Australia for the invitation to speak to this audience today on such an important topic. The ruling earlier this month of the UK High Court ordering Assange's extradition to the United States has thrown the essential political issues involved in his case into stark relief. Assange's life is in imminent danger. He is being held in intolerable conditions, and he is threatened post any extradition with even worse, a rigged trial, facing charges under the Espionage Act, with a life sentence in the deepest, darkest hole the American prison system can dig. The US, the UK, and Australian governments will not relent in their pursuit, and the courts stand fully exposed as participants in their criminal enterprise. By any proper legal or democratic standard, proceedings against Assange have been a travesty of justice. The judiciary has consistently taken the desired outcomes of British and US imperialism and worked backwards to fashion rulings and judgments to suit these ends. What did the High Court say 2 weeks ago? It accepted assurances given by the US government that Assange would be well treated during his imprisonment in the United States. Now, on their face, as Assange's lawyers explained in detail, these assurances are nothing of the sort. the United States reserves the right to impose any conditions on Assange it sees fit. And looked at in a broader context, the assurances in the High Court's ruling are even more cynical. As Assange's lawyer, Mark Summers, told the judges, quote, "This is the first time of which we are aware that the US has sought the assistance of a UK court in obtaining jurisdiction over someone where the evidence suggests it has contemplated, if not plotted, the assassination, kidnap, rendering, poisoning of that person." That is, the assurances are given by one participant in a murderous conspiracy against Assange, the US government, to a co-participant, the UK government. And yet the head of the judiciary in England and Wales wrote in his judgment, "The reality is that this court is being invited to reject the USA's assurances, either on the basis that they are not offered in good faith, or that they are for some other reason not capable of being accepted at face value. That is a serious allegation, particularly bearing in mind that the United Kingdom and the USA have a long history of cooperation in extradition matters. There is no reason why this court should not accept the assurances as meaning what they say." Or to put it in plain English, the court was not in the slightest concerned with Assange's clearly abused legal and democratic rights, but with furthering the interests and the relationship of British and American imperialism. Now, this is only the latest link in an unbroken chain of outrages. Britain has played the role of jailer for the US for the last 10 years. In June 2012, Assange was forced to seek political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London after a fraudulent and malicious sexual assault investigation begun by Sweden created a pretext for his arrest. Assange sought asylum in fear of onward extradition once he was in the clutches of either Britain or Sweden to the United States. He was kept confined to that embassy for nearly 7 years, unable to step outside without fear of being seized by a permanent British police presence. Sweden refused to progress their investigation, leaving the threat of arrest hanging over him. In February 2016, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention ruled that Assange was being arbitrarily detained and called for his release and his compensation. And the British government, of course, ignored that decision. In fact, the Crown Prosecution Service were writing to the Swedish prosecutors, who at that point were beginning to get nervous, "Don't you dare get cold feet." And they explained that the British state, quote, "did not consider costs a relevant factor in this matter." Meanwhile, the CIA were conducting an extraordinary surveillance operation of Assange in the embassy in preparation for far worse. Former employees at the Spanish company which provided security to the Ecuadorian embassy have given evidence that the company did a deal with American intelligence to spy on Assange and his associates on their behalf. This included installing hidden cameras and microphones, even in the toilets, to record Assange's every word, including privileged conversations with his lawyers and medical professionals. His visitors had their phones, laptops, and papers investigated. And after Assange was seized from the embassy, his own papers, again including legal documents, were taken and shipped away. The surveillance was so complete and so intrusive that UC Global even considered stealing a diaper or a pacifier from a child brought to visit Assange in order to run a DNA test. The whistleblowers at the company also stated that discussions were held on means of kidnapping or poisoning Assange in the embassy. Now, this was substantiated by a bombshell Yahoo News investigation released this September based on conversations with 30 well-placed sources. The news site revealed that plans were made at the highest level of the CIA for Assange's assassination, with President Trump asking for options as to how this could be done. In the event of a feared Russian-backed escape from the embassy, the US secured Britain's agreement for a shootout in the streets of London. Now, in parallel to this lawless, gangsterish conspiracy, the US and the UK were piling pressure on Ecuador to give Assange up. In his recently published diaries, former British Foreign Office Minister Sir Alan Duncan refers euphemistically to many months of patient diplomatic negotiation. Now, what did that actually entail? In October 2018, the US House Foreign Affairs Committee made clear to Ecuador that giving up Assange would be necessary for the US to, quote, move forward in collaborating with your government on a wide array of issues, from economic cooperation to the possible return of a United States Agency for International Development mission to Ecuador. In March 2019, Ecuador secured a $4.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. The former Ecuadorian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ricardo Patiño, commented afterwards, "The arrest of Mr. Assange is part of Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno's agreement with the IMF." Now, these efforts had an immediate impact. Ecuador imposed a communications blackout on Assange and prevented friends or supporters from visiting him. His contact with the outside world was later partially restored only on the condition that he refrained from activities that could be considered as political and interference in the internal affairs of other states, or that may harm the good relations of Ecuador with another state, a clear infringement of his freedom of speech and political expression. And of course, ultimately in April 2018, Ecuador withdrew Assange's asylum, a violation of that right, and allowed the British police into the embassy to seize him. Assange had his Ecuadorian citizenship stripped for good measure just this July. Finally able to get their hands on Assange, the UK courts began making up for lost time, arresting him on a bail violation linked to the initial Swedish investigation, which had by that point been dropped repeatedly, and jailing him for the near maximum sentence of 50 weeks in Britain's top security prison, Belmarsh. After that, he was held on remand without charge to await his extradition hearing. The first UK judge to see Assange branded him a narcissist who cannot get beyond his own selfish interests. The second accused him of exploiting your privileged position to flout the law and advertise internationally your disdain for the law of this country. Now, in reality, the only ones showing disdain for the law were the British courts and prison system. Throughout his time in Belmarsh, Assange had access to his lawyers interrupted and was denied the time or the material necessary to prepare for his case against all rights of due process. And this abuse continued into the first phase of his extradition hearing held in February 2020. On the first day, Assange was handcuffed 11 times and strip searched twice. He was repeatedly barred from speaking in court and prevented from communicating effectively and privately with his lawyers. At the second evidentiary phase of his hearing last October, his prosecutors argued absurdly, and the judge later accepted, that his case had nothing to do with the war crimes, wars of aggression and collateral murder, extraordinary rendition and torture exposed by WikiLeaks, and that the US arguments pose no threat to freedom of the press or freedom of speech. The court also accepted the tissue of lies designed to portray Assange as a hacker, not a journalist, and rubber-stamped a litany of abuses of due process, including the US's serving of an 11th hour superseding indictment, which was designed to shore up its shredded legal case with no time allowed for the defense to prepare a response. One of the defense's arguments at that hearing was that extraditing Assange would be oppressive by virtue of his mental health, providing compelling evidence that the experience would drive him to suicide. The point highlighted the degree to which the previous years of persecution have destroyed Assange's health with potentially life-threatening consequences. In November 2019, the campaign group Doctors for Assange was established to expose his conditions of incarceration and to fight for his humane medical treatment. They concluded in an open letter that same month, quote, "We have real concerns on the evidence currently available that Mr. Assange could die in prison. The medical situation is thereby urgent. There is no time to lose." The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, then visited Assange in prison the same year and concluded that he showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture. His multiple letters of concern sent to the United Kingdom government were either dismissed or ignored. The deliberate endangering of Assange's life was summed up by a judge's refusal to grant him bail, even as COVID-19 spread through the prison system, despite his chronic lung condition and heavily weakened immune system. As the World Socialist Web Site wrote at the time, the unavoidable conclusion is that Assange's persecutors hope to see the COVID-19 disease do their dirty work for them and kill the most significant journalist of the 21st century. Now, it was on the basis of his risk of suicide that the judge in Assange's extradition hearing gave the initial decision this January not to extradite. But we warned that this was an extremely calculated ruling, accepting all the anti-democratic arguments put forward by the US government, designed to leave Assange's fate hanging by a single thread of his mental health, which could then be cut by a higher court. Now, this proved entirely accurate. The Yahoo News revelations made clear what had actually taken place. In the knowledge of the CIA's murderous plots, the UK ruling class clearly felt that it lacked sufficient deniability for its own participation. This could be achieved, they hoped, by striking a pose of concern in the lower court and leaving the door wide open for the decision to be reversed. Step one in this plan was to keep Assange imprisoned until the US, now under President Biden, had made its appeal. Step two was for the High Court to grant broad grounds for an appeal to the US lawyers. And now the High Court has completed step three, ordering his extradition. All of this is, of course, just cause for outrage, but not for surprise. Assange is a class war prisoner, and the courts, an instrument of the British state, have delivered class justice in the interests of UK imperialism. As important as it has been to fight the legal case, to expose the countless violations of his democratic rights, and it is important, Assange's salvation has never been the British judiciary. His freedom and defence have always depended on a mass movement of the international working class. As the Socialist Equality Parties explained, launching our global defence campaign, quote, "The international working class is more powerful than all of the governments, intelligence agencies and corporations combined. Just as the capitalist class is using the persecution of Assange as the linchpin of their plans for a dictatorship, so the working class must make his defence the focal point for a counter-offensive against militarism and all attacks on democratic and social rights." The real damage to the fight for Assange's freedom has therefore been done by those who have opposed this orientation and directed the campaign not to the working class, but to the courts, right-wing governments, liberal NGOs and media organisations, and tame and toothless so-called lefts. Only by understanding the failure of this perspective can the fight to defend Assange be taken forward. The political bankruptcy of the official Don't Extradite Assange campaign is summed up by their advancing former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn as a champion of Assange's cause. Corbyn has the dishonour of being the man in a position to do the most for Assange's cause, who in reality did the least. From the moment he became Labour leader in 2015, he maintained a stony silence on Assange. A word from him could have summoned hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to the streets in the WikiLeaks founder's defence, but he chose to keep his mouth shut. He was finally forced to comment when Assange was dragged from the embassy to the gloating of the Tory government. Corbyn issued a tweet opposing Assange's extradition, but then retreated within 48 hours in the face of a right-wing attack by his own Labour MPs, demanding Assange be sent to Sweden. For the next 10 months, including the entirety of the general election that was held that year, the words Assange and WikiLeaks did not pass Corbyn's lips once, even when he was directly confronted with the issue. Since handing leadership of the Labour Party to Sir Keir Starmer, who played a vital part in Assange's persecution as head of the Department of Public Prosecutions, Corbyn has made what could only charitably be described as sporadic references to Assange's plight. He has kept those remarks limited to homilies on British justice, so-called, and appeals to Prime Minister Boris Johnson to do the right thing. Others around Corbyn have extended this appeal to Biden and even to Trump when he was president. Or they have directed their efforts to securing endorsements from a ragtag band of NGOs, unions, media publications, celebrities, and handfuls of parliamentary representatives. In fear of a mass movement of the working class, their orientation is entirely to the courts, to the Labour bureaucracy, and the supposedly progressive liberal middle class, among whom there is no real constituency for democratic rights, and the bulk of whom view Assange with contempt. This whole perspective has proven disastrous. Which brings us to the question of where are we now? The situation is extremely urgent. Assange will appeal the High Court decision, but there is no guarantee that the next court will agree to hear his case, meaning extradition could take place rapidly. Even if an appeal is granted, this means months and years more kept in prison in torturous conditions. One day after the High Court ruling, Assange's partner, Stella Morris, revealed that he had suffered a stroke during the hearing. His life is at grave risk every day longer that he is in Belmarsh. At the same time, the issues involved in his case are clearer than ever. There is a broad popular radicalization taking place, driven by the pandemic and its economic fallout. And the international working class is increasingly developing its own independent political movement, expressed in the formation of rank and file committees across the world. It is in this movement that the campaign to free Assange can sink deep and strong roots. No single individual will free Assange, nor will plaintive appeals or legal arguments. Only the movement of an enormous social force, which every one of us can play our part in educating, organizing, and mobilizing, so long as we understand the challenges that are posed and arm ourselves with the right political program to overcome them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, look, I think, and I'm sure by looking at the comments that Thomas's contribution and remarks are very compelling and also very important, because what they do highlight is, again, who is responsible for the situation which Julian Assange faces. This was not necessary. There was a movement. There was enormous support for Julian Assange. And so the question has to be asked, what happened? How did that groundswell of enormous regard and support for him and for WikiLeaks, for what they revealed, how was it diverted? And so I think, to speak on those questions and others, our next speaker is Oscar Grenfell, who I'm sure I don't really need to introduce, but I will anyway. Oscar is a National Committee member of the SEP. He joined the party in 2007. He's the national convener of the IYSSE, the youth movement of the SEP, and he has also written widely on the class struggle in Australia, the political situation here, including, of course, the development of the pandemic, and on the situation facing Julian Assange, and the response of the Australian political establishment to it, and the so-called lefts. So I'm very pleased to introduce Comrade Oscar, And again, on your behalf, I welcome him.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I'd also like to welcome everyone taking part in this meeting, particularly our many international participants this evening. Comrade Tom's report makes crystal clear the urgency of the fight to free Assange. The High Court ruling proves that the British judiciary is functioning as a criminal accomplice of the US plot to destroy the WikiLeaks publisher. And his stroke last October is a warning that Assange's life is in imminent danger. In developing this struggle, several key questions need to be addressed. Why are the US and all of its allies pursuing a publisher and a journalist with such ruthless ferocity? What are the political forces responsible for Assange's plight? And what is the relationship between the fight for his liberty and the major political issues confronting workers and young people today? It's worth briefly recalling what it is that the US is seeking to prosecute Assange for. The American indictment covers 4 WikiLeaks publications released from 2010 to 11. Firstly, the US Army's Afghan war logs. They recorded some 20,000 deaths. This included at least 195 civilian casualties at the hands of NATO troops, which had previously been hidden from the public. Incidents revealed by the logs included NATO troops opening fire on school buses, bombing wedding parties, and the US military operating a secret assassination squad in Afghanistan. The second publication is the US Army's Iraq war logs. They recorded 109,000 Iraqi deaths. At least 66,081 of those were described by the US Army as civilians. This included some 15,000 civilian fatalities that had been completely covered up. The logs document torture and indiscriminate killings, such as those shown in the collateral murder video. And thirdly, 250,000 leaked US diplomatic cables. They contain an almost innumerable number of revelations, from US support for coups in Thailand and Honduras to proof of the pillage of Africa's environment by major corporations, illegal US spying on UN officials, and backing for corrupt dictatorships throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and more broadly. And finally, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, comprising more than 750 prisoner reports by the US Army. The files proved the American government knew most of the people it was detaining at this hellhole were Afghan and Pakistani villagers and other completely innocent people. The youngest was a 14-year-old boy, the oldest an 88-year-old Afghan farmer with dementia. Now, each of these publications was of immense historic importance, but their significance was even greater when placed in political context. By 2010, the mass anti-war movement that had seen millions march against the invasion of Iraq had been suppressed. The pseudo-left groups, the Greens, and the unions that politically dominated that movement had wound it up and directed it behind the election of Obama in the US, a president who would be at war for his full 2 terms, and other pro-war parties, such as Labor in this country. The Iraq and Afghan war logs brought the horror of these neo-colonial operations to a new generation and revived the mass opposition to imperialist war. The diplomatic cables revealed that the criminality of imperialist policy was not, however, limited to war. By documenting the daily intrigues, conspiracies, and lies of official diplomacy, they demonstrated the rotten character of the entire capitalist order. And these publications had a huge impact on popular consciousness, radicalizing millions of workers and young people and contributing to revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia that overthrew US-backed dictatorships, which had been in power for decades. Assange was widely and correctly viewed as a heroic and courageous figure. The first meetings of the Australian SEP defending Assange in December 2010 were attended by large numbers of students and young people, as were protests supporting WikiLeaks at the same time. We've raised the question on the WSWS. How is it that 11 years later, the horrifying persecution of Assange can proceed as it is without provoking mass demonstrations? Now, certainly the US responded to the 2010 and 2011 publications by mobilizing full repressive power of the American state apparatus, but that alone does not answer the question. As we commented in a WSWS Perspective article by Comrade Tom, quote, Assange was the first and most significant victim of the gender-based political witch hunting, in which accusations of sexual crimes are elevated to the status of unchallengeable fact and used to destroy due process and the presumption of innocence. Issues of class and political principle are drowned in a tide of denunciations by those claiming to speak on behalf of the rights of women, but who advance the interests of imperialism and the affluent middle class. The Swedish investigation into supposed sexual misconduct allegations against Assange began in August 2010, that is right as WikiLeaks was publishing its most explosive revelations and senior US politicians were calling for Assange's assassination. This investigation, which was dropped 3 times and never passed beyond the preliminary phase, was a complete frame-up. To cite only several facts which inescapably lead to this conclusion, just list them. One of the complainants texted a friend saying she did not want to accuse Julian Assange for anything and that it was the police who made up the charges. Her statement was rewritten by a police officer. The only physical evidence in the case, a torn condom presented by the other complainant, did not contain any DNA. That is, it was fabricated evidence. The initial prosecutor had stated, quote, I do not think there is reason to suspect that he, that is Assange, has committed rape, and that the conduct alleged by SW, one of the complainants, disclosed no crime at all. The investigation was then taken up by another prosecutor who had extensive secret communications with the US FBI and the British Crown Prosecution Service. The Swedish authorities rejected offers to interview Assange in London for years, demanding that he instead travel to Sweden, but they refused to provide any guarantee against onward extradition to the United States. Not only was this sham investigation used to embroil Assange in the British legal system, it provided the ideological cement for an unholy alliance of the US intelligence agencies, the so-called liberal press, such as The Guardian, upper middle class feminists, and the pseudo-left. All of them slandered the WikiLeaks founder as a sexual criminal, a rapist, and a fugitive from justice based on this frame-up. In this country, Assange was abandoned by the Greens, the trade unions, and virtually all of the media. The pseudo-left parties played a central role. The Australian Socialist Alternative, for instance, declared in 2012, quote, he should face questioning and be held to account if it transpires that he committed such an offence. The use of identity politics by these layers to attack Assange went hand in hand with their open embrace of so-called human rights imperialism. As they were lining up against the WikiLeaks founder, parties such as Socialist Alternative became the most enthusiastic cheerleaders for the CIA regime change operations in Syria and Libya. The fight for Assange's freedom, in other words, is a political fight against this entire upper middle class milieu, which provides the ground troops and the filthy ideology for imperialist war and the accompanying attacks on democratic rights. The other political issue at the centre of Assange's plight that must be addressed at this meeting is the role of Australian governments. The pattern was really set by the Labor government, Julia Gillard. As US politicians were baying for Assange's blood, Gillard falsely claimed that he and WikiLeaks were guilty of unspecified crimes. Her government tried to illegally tear up his passport and pledged to help the US intelligence agencies in their campaign to destroy WikiLeaks. It should never be forgotten that Gillard's government was in a minority. It was dependent for its very survival on the Greens, who were in a de facto coalition with Labor. When we challenged then Greens Senator Scott Ludlam about Gillard's attacks on Assange, he said it was all very unfortunate, but it wasn't worth, quote unquote, crashing the government over. And the course laid out by that Greens-backed Labor government has been followed by all of its successors. No doubt, over recent weeks, many at this meeting will have seen the statements of Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, other Liberal national figures, as well as Labor leader Anthony Albanese and Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong. In different forms, they've bemoaned Assange's plight, feigned sympathy for his medical issues, and declared that the saga has gone on too long. Of course, none of them have referenced their own role in ensuring that this persecution has continued for more than 10 years. And the essential position that they've advanced is that there's nothing they can or will do to intervene. Joyce, for instance, the second most powerful office holder in the country, declared in the pages of the Sydney Morning Herald last week, quote, "I have no power in Britain or the US over these matters. I have no standing in the British courts." The Labor leaders said the same while proclaiming their respect to the British courts that are presiding over the slow motion murder of Assange. Now, these are bald-faced lies. The Australian government has a clear political and legal obligation to defend citizens who are persecuted abroad. That's established not only in international law, but also in precedent. Over the course of Assange's persecution, Australian governments have made diplomatic interventions to secure the freedom of journalist Peter Grester from an Egyptian prison in 2015, filmmaker James Ricketson from Cambodian detention in 2018, the Bahraini footballer and Australian permanent resident Hakeem Al-Arabi from Thailand in 2019, and academic Kylie Moore-Gilbert from Iranian incarceration last year. In contrast to these cases, the Australian government and Labor offer Assange consular assistance. This is a form of government aid usually provided to those who have lost their passports abroad or suffered similar minor inconveniences. In Assange's case, this consular assistance means DFAT, monitoring the deterioration of Assange's health and the progression of his persecution, not in order to end it, but to minimise the fallout for the Australian government. The Greens have issued more strident condemnations of the British ruling over recent weeks. But for the past 3 years, they've rejected calls, including from within their own ranks, for a public party campaign demanding Assange's freedom. And what's their perspective at the forthcoming election? Again, to lobby for some sort of coalition with the Labor Party. In their hypocritical and mealy-mouthed statements, the official politicians are seeking to head off a groundswell of support for Assange. A petition calling for his freedom has been signed by more than 700,000 people, and on social media, hundreds of thousands or even millions more have expressed their support. The crucial question is, how is this sentiment to be taken forward? The first and perhaps most crucial step is to dispense with futile illusions that are a dead end at worst and a cover for the very forces responsible for Assange's plight at worst. Assange's freedom is not going to be secured by writing friendly letters to your local MP or by imploring Albanese to grow a spine. That's not the way forward. The persecution of Assange is embedded in the political situation we face. And what is that situation? An unprecedented crisis of the global capitalist system and a dramatic lurch to the right by the ruling elites everywhere. A decade ago, the Gillard Labor government's support for the attacks on Assange was inextricably tied to its backing of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, a massive military buildup directed against China. 10 years on, and these war preparations are far advanced. Australia joined with the US and Britain to form AUKUS last September, an aggressive military alliance explicitly aimed at preparing a conflict with China. Australian Foreign Minister Dutton has repeatedly declared Australia would take part in a US war against China, aimed at ensuring Washington's hegemony in the Asia Pacific. And for its part, Labor is pitching itself as a more reliable ally of American imperialism. The assault on democratic rights is likewise escalating. The government, again with Labor's support, has deployed the Assange precedent in raids targeting Australian journalists and is overseeing the secret prosecution of whistleblowers of Australian imperialist crimes in East Timor and Afghanistan. And political rights are also under attack. The SEP and dozens of other parties face the prospect of deregistration after Labor and the coalition came together to pass anti-democratic electoral laws aimed at clearing the ballot of any alternative on the eve of a federal election. And as Cheryl raised, on the major issue of our time, the pandemic, the entire political establishment is at war with the population. Labor and the coalition, with the support of all the other official parties, are implementing the same herd immunity policies that have resulted in millions of deaths around the world. They've lifted all safety measures to ensure full corporate profit making, as medical experts warn that Omicron will crash the underfunded hospital systems and kill thousands of people. This determination to put profits before health and lives is driven by a profound underlying crisis of the economic and financial system. The fear in ruling circles is that the massive bubble of financial speculation that's been built up over decades, especially since 2008, and even more so the past 2 years, could implode if workers are not driven back to their places of employment, where surplus value, the true source of wealth, can be pumped out of them. All of this is provoking mass anger and opposition. There's a movement of the working class emerging here and internationally against the onslaught on jobs, wages and conditions, the homicidal pandemic policies, and the capitalist system itself. At the most fundamental level, the persecution of Assange is aimed at intimidating this opposition in the working class and creating a precedent for its suppression. Now, the fight for Assange's freedom is up against the US government, its military, intelligence agencies, and all of its allies, including the Australian ruling elite. There's no doubt that these are very powerful forces. So in developing this struggle, defenders of Assange must turn to an even more powerful force, and that is the international working class. This year has witnessed a resurgence of the class struggle. In the US, thousands of Volvo trucks workers were on strike for months, then thousands of John Deere agricultural workers. There have been protests by teachers, health workers, and many other sections. And this is a global phenomenon. In Australia, 2021 saw the first national strike by truck drivers in more than a decade, the first stoppage of New South Wales teachers in over 10 years, mass action by rail workers and bus drivers in Sydney, unrest on the ports, and the list could go on. The logic of all of these struggles is towards a rebellion against the mechanisms that have been used to suppress the class struggle for the past 40 years, above all the corrupt and thoroughly corporatized trade unions. Our call for independent rank and file committees, controlled by workers themselves, is now being taken up by ever-growing numbers of workers in struggle. And the strikes and protests that have occurred thus far are only a harbinger of what is to come. Millions of people increasingly recognise that capitalism offers them only a future of war, poverty, unemployment, and death. The SEP, which has fought to defend Assange and WikiLeaks for more than a decade, is fully committed to taking forward this struggle. We'll centrally raise the defence of Assange in the forthcoming election, and above all, we'll do everything we can to bring the defence of this courageous journalist and publisher to the struggles of the working class as part of the broader fight for social equality, an end to militarism and war, and genuine democracy. That is the fight for socialism. I'd urge everyone here to join us in this decisive struggle. Thank you.
Thanks, Oscar. Look, I think both the reports have raised many, many questions, and I must confess there is an absolute avalanche of comments and questions in the chat. I know numbers of participants have raised what can we do. I think Oscar has addressed some of those issues, but there are other points. One is, out of lack of knowledge, has there ever been a similar situation or scenario where another journalist has been through the same as Assange? As per Tom saying, the UK doesn't see why the US will not honour what they say as the history between the US and the UK when it comes to expediting whistleblowers. They have not dishonoured. When and what was the last case of expediting between the US and the UK? Alan has raised, there is no doubt Joyce is, this is Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Prime Minister, about whom Oscar referred, is implicated in supporting imperialist wars, but he has spoken out on Assange's treatment. Surely that can be used to leverage more action on Assange. Then Alan has raised again, now I've lost it, hang on. Surely the more we embarrass politicians, especially in the lead up to a federal election, that can provide some impetus on freeing Assange. Now there's numbers of comments along this line about female independent members of parliament. Surely they can be prevailed upon to make a stand in defence of Assange. One question was, I thought Assange was already an Australian election topic. Is it not? And it was answered, no, it's not. Another one, has the Australian Greens abandoned Assange? Peter Wilson is a member of the Bring Assange Home Parliamentary Group. So there's numbers of questions and comments along that line. So maybe, Oscar, you could address that, and the issue of, and I'm assuming the questioner has asked whether there's other situations of journalists in the UK who have faced such extradition proceedings, which possibly Tom could refer to. So maybe we could start with that. I mean, there is a lot, and I'm afraid I think we may not be able to get to them all because there are so many, but we'll try and deal with as many as we possibly can. So maybe, Oscar, if you want to begin.
Yeah, I can make some points in opening. I think, there's a common theme in many of the comments, the questions in the chat. What is to be done? What's the way forward? Which we've, touched on in our reports. There's no question that, definite activities need to be undertaken in defence of Assange. Public meetings. I mean, we've called this meeting because we recognise the importance of forums such as this, the spreading of information on Twitter and social media, the publication of articles revealing the truth about this case. Action needs to be taken, but I think the crucial question is, what is the political perspective that action is taken on or is based on? And if you look at the record of the past 10 years, I mean, there's been no shortage of appeals to bourgeois capitalist politicians, capitalist governments to intervene in Assange's defence, to end their persecution. What's it led to? As Tom's report reviewed, I mean, Assange is now in maximum security prison where he's been for 3 years. He's closer to being extradited to the United States than ever before, and his health is in a dire crisis. These governments are not persecuting Assange because they're mistaken, because they don't have all of the facts about the case. They've invested tremendous resources on this over a decade of their time. And I think, as we sought to indicate, it's because this is connected to much broader political issues. I mean, the persecution of Assange, as far as the US government and its allies are concerned, is to send a message, not just to other journalists, other whistleblowers, but really to the working class, that anti-war opposition, opposition to the onslaught on social rights, the homicidal pandemic policies will not be tolerated. I think the comments of Australian politicians over the past couple of weeks are significant. I mean, there has been more discussion about Assange in the press than there has been for numbers of years. There's no question that what they're responding to is a groundswell of anger, of opposition from below. But I think it is worth looking very carefully at what they're saying. I mean, Albanese's position, to the extent that he mentions Assange, has never changed. He's adamant that he will not do a thing to defend this persecuted persecuted Australian citizen and journalist. That's the same thing that Barnaby Joyce said. And it's true. I mean, the Greens have said, oh, this is a shocking, horrific ruling in Britain. Assange is a hero. He exposed war crimes. What are they going to do about it? Nothing. I mean, their perspective at the upcoming federal election is to form a coalition with Labor. So I think in this country and everywhere else, I mean, you have a political establishment that is hurtling to the right. It's attacking democratic rights. It's escalating the drive to war, and it's attacking the most basic rights of the population in the pandemic. And Assange's persecution is a part of that. It can't be separated from that broader political context, which, you know, I think is what is sometimes done. Various groups which call for, you know, letter writing targeted at politicians, appeals to Biden or Albanese or whoever else, they decouple Assange's plight from the broader political context, which is, you know, an intense crisis of the capitalist system, a turn to dictatorship, to war, and an eruption of the class struggle. So we, you know, very much reject that orientation. It's been tried, it's been tested, it's failed. The alternative is to build a political movement to fight for Assange's freedom. That's how, you know, political prisoners have been freed in the past. If you look at some of the great cases of the 20th century, Sacco and Vanzetti and others, the key question was the mobilization of the independent political power of the working class as part of the fight against war, the fight against authoritarianism. Just the final point I'd make, you know, we don't disagree with placing demands on governments. I mean, for the past 3 years or more, our party has been holding events demanding that the Australian government intervene to free Assange. We've held rallies, public meetings, online campaigns, and the like. But what we've always explained is that they'll only take this step, which would come up against the US alliance, against their own attack on democratic rights domestically, if they're forced to do so by mass pressure from below. So it's not a question of, you know, appealing to the conscience of these rotten right-wing capitalist politicians, pleading with them. It's an issue of forcing them to take the action that they're obligated to, because they'll be fearful, you know, of the political consequences if they don't. And that means mobilizing a social force.
Thanks, Oscar. Tom, did you want to make any points?
Sure. And just to, I'll turn to the question you indicated, but to support what Oscar said at the end there on the question of essentially appeals versus demands. You know, he's quite right. The demand is correctly made of those who are holding Assange in prison and persecuting him, that they release him immediately. The issue with the appeals is that action disorients and demobilizes the mass action the mass movement that has to be built, to the degree that it's being suggested that governments can be politely persuaded to change their mind, can have a change of heart, can suddenly rediscover their democratic sensibilities and so on. In the first place, if you're suggesting that's the case, you're demotivating people to come out and put forward the necessary pressure and build the scale of movement that's actually necessary to force Assange's freedom. More fundamentally, you end up, you present a false image of what the ruling class actually is and what motivates them, and you sow illusions in their ability or willingness to act at all in Assange's favor. As Oscar said, this is a political elite that has proven time and time again that it is utterly hostile to democratic rights in general and to Assange in particular, where it's not just a question of democratic rights, although that's a major element. It's a question of anti-militarist, anti-war sentiment that WikiLeaks increased, spoke to, threatened to ignite. And in conditions in which there are military flashpoints all over the world, where there's a ramping up of military tensions and provocations against Russia and China, the significance of WikiLeaks journalism has only grown, and therefore their incentive, their need and class interest in persecuting him has also grown. So there's no action that they will take in his favor that is not made out of, frankly, an enormous fear of a mass movement that's been created and that will topple them from power otherwise. On the question of the UK's previous actions against journalists, its previous uses of extradition, I mean, the UK has a thoroughly rotten record of extradition to the United States, which extends from the extradition of those who the United States has sought on terror charges, whose human rights have then been violated once they reach the United States. The UK knows they will be, of course they do, everyone knows the conditions that exist in the US courts and the US prison system. They are all extradited as a matter of routine. As far as the direct attack on journalists recently in the UK, it's a very significant recent case is that of Craig Murray, who was in prison recently, a vindictive sentence for someone of his age and medical condition, actually for his reporting of a government corruption abuse case in Scotland. And he was alleged by the government to have jigsaw identified, that is, through presenting a number of pieces of information here and there, to have identified a number of alleged victims in a ongoing court investigation, broadly recognized as a nonsense decision. What lay behind it in large part is that Murray has been is a prominent reporter of the Assange case, and he has encountered problems in acquiring press credentials as a result of this, and it doubtless informed the punitive action that was taken against him by the Scottish court. There have been previous examples of, if not journalists, then whistleblowers being punitively targeted by the UK around the Iraq War, of course very relevant to the discussion here today. That of Catherine Gunn, who's an intelligence analyst within the British state, who came across evidence that the US was forcing, exerting pressure on countries in the UN for a mandate to invade Iraq, leaked this information as being clearly in the public interest and information she hoped that would avert a war. She was pursued viciously under the Official Secrets Act, which is draconian enough that Gunn couldn't even discuss what she was on, what she was being charged with her own lawyers. To do so would have implicated her further in the violation of the Official Secrets Act. She was surveilled. There were threats made to deport her husband, attacks on her family, all the rest. You know, the UK ruling class is brutal in the defense of its interests, and it's not constrained by any concern for any democratic rights. Ultimately, the case against Gunn had to be withdrawn in the context of the mass movement that was developing against the Iraq War, and the fact that the UK government would have been compelled to reveal that it had essentially been shown evidence that the war in Iraq was unfounded and illegal. They are trying to put in place, and the Assange case is about setting a precedent for this, measures that will make it even harder, bordering on impossible, to carry out any such leaks in the future. There's legislation being proposed by the Home Office at the moment, which would remove the public interest offence, which is already extremely limited, for the release of the leaking of sensitive information. You can claim now that if it's sufficiently in the public interest, you have a defence. The UK government are trying to remove that. They're trying to ensure not only that the leaking of that information, but that the onward distribution of that information, that is the reporting, basic journalistic work, could be considered criminal. That is one of the fundamental issues at stake in the Assange trial. To increase the maximum sentence for that to 14 years, so that would include for journalists, and even to develop laws which allow them to order particular individuals or organizations not to report, not to make public certain information. So yes, there is precedent for the UK's assault on journalism, for its participation in the pseudo-legal extradition of people to the United States. And they're using the Assange case, which is by far the most significant, there's been no doubt about that, to develop that attack on democratic rights even further, which I think underscores the point made by Oscar, that appeals to any section of this political class are ultimately on a hiding to nothing, and serve to disorient and confuse the issues that are actually at stake in the Assange case. The Assange case reveals the fundamental division, the fundamental lack of any concern for democratic rights in the ruling class and all of their political representatives. And there are those who actually carry forward the right-wing attacks, extend the dictatorial authoritarian laws. There are those who make some noises of protest, but who insist that all opposition must go through the parliamentary channels, so on and so forth, who turn the campaign against these attacks away from the fight in the working class that has to be waged. They play a double act in that. And this is why our insistence is that the campaign has to be turned to and rooted in an independent social force of the working class. Thanks,
Tom. Look, there's many comments and questions coming in. There is one which I will raise, and then I just wanted to address a couple of points of in regards to some issues and points that have been made in the chat. Frank asks, also, does the panel consider Hillary Clinton's 2016 exposed criminal emails, whereas Russia and Assange were implicated, important to delve into at this point? So Oscar or Tom can think about the answer to that, but I just wanted to raise a couple of points. There was a question in regards to weren't these election issues, and one of the other participants in the meeting correctly said no, they weren't. In fact, in 2019, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the same day or the day after Julian Assange was removed from the Ecuadorian embassy in April of 2019, Scott Morrison announced the election. And there was, I think, one comment in response to a question by journalists about what the attitude of the government was to the forced removal of an Australian citizen and their incarceration in Belmarsh prison. Morrison's response was that he had all the faith in the world in the British legal system, and that this really didn't have anything to do with the Australian government, and consular assistance would be provided. The leader of the opposition at that time, Bill Shorten, said a similar thing and solidarised himself with Morrison. That was, I think, on the first day that the election was announced, and in the course of the other 33 days, Julian Assange was not mentioned by a single other political party, with the exception of the Socialist Equality Party. The only candidates who raised and made central, in fact, to our campaign was the SEP. And we did that because we understood that, bound up with the situation and the conspiracy against Assange, the attempt to silence him, the escalation of the attack against him, was an attack certainly against him, but against the working class as a whole, and to intimidate, to attempt to ensure that the lead, the example which he had undertaken was not followed up by anybody else. And the Socialist Alliance did not mention Assange. No other political party in the course of that election. And Assange was, as you can imagine, very, very prominent in the media at the time. It did not, it was not central in any way other than in our campaign. There is another point that was made about David Hicks, and wasn't there a campaign in defence of David Hicks, and wasn't that why he was brought home? I mean, there is a very important element of truth in what the reader or the participant in the meeting has raised. In fact, there was a campaign, and it was led and organised in particular by David's father, Terry Hicks, who we interviewed many times. We had discussions with, and he fought in an intransigent way to mobilise the population, to mobilise support for the release of his son, who was in Guantanamo Bay. He as a young man had become a Muslim. He had gone to Afghanistan. He had trained there. He was then kidnapped by the US Army and sent to Guantanamo Bay, where he languished, being tortured for years without being charged. And when he was charged, his plight and his case was the subject of a great deal of interest and support by sections of the population and the working class in Australia. He was brought back to Australia, but in order to do so, he had to plead guilty to charges which he had always maintained his innocence, and for which there was absolutely no evidence of his guilt. He came back, he was brought back to Australia, I think it was under the Howard government, and served his remaining 9 months in jail in Adelaide. But it was bound up with enormous opposition to his continued incarceration, and the fact that the Howard government refused, as every other government in regards to Julian Assange, refused to lift a finger to assist Hicks, or as they have done with Julian Assange. But the issues that Oscar and Tom have raised, that the fight for the mobilisation of the working class is in order that not that workers think that their fate is therefore in the hands of appeals of as it has been raised in the chat, of nagging politicians, but in themselves fighting to mobilise in order that they understand their own independent strength, their own self-activity, and in so doing understand that it is only through that fight for their own independent struggles and organisation, independent of those of the unions, of Parliament, all of these organisations whose role it is to tie workers to a parliamentary perspective. That is the purpose of the fight to develop a mass movement in defence of Julian Assange to demand his immediate release, as it is, as I've raised in regards to the inquest. There was another question about what the percentage was of the SEP's vote in the last election. To be honest, the percentage I can't remember. No one is suggesting that we receive a mass vote, but we do receive an extraordinarily significant conscious vote, and that vote was higher than any other socialist organisation in the 2019 election, and it was certainly, as it was in regards to other so-called minor parties, the parties that don't have parliamentary representation, it was enough to facilitate and force, or to provoke the government in collaboration with Labor to enact laws, electoral laws, in August of this year, in August of 2021, that was designed to deregister 36 minor parties, 36 parties that had stood in the election in 2019, for whom they did not have enough votes to get a parliamentary representative. But in the intervening 3 years, the opposition, which was expressed in that election, in which Labor received the lowest vote in something like 100 years, and the only reason that the Morrison government was actually elected, was able to come to power with a very, very small majority, is because Labor lost more votes than Morrison. It wasn't a question of who won votes, it's who lost the most. And all the polls, all the indications are that this election will be even sharper. In fact, the indications are that no party, whether it's the Liberal coalition government or Labor, would be able to form a majority government, a functioning government. And that was highlighted by the very fact that prior to Parliament retiring, stopping in November of 2021, the government was unable to pass any bills. It had to completely dispense with its legislative agenda because the government itself was breaking apart. Its own members were mutinying and refusing to vote for the bills, not from the left, so let me tell you, but very much from the right. And so you had a government which literally limped to the end of Parliament, and which now has to face an election before May of 2022, for which neither of the major parties have any real base of support. And so the answer, both by Liberal and Labor, was to enact this legislation to deregister 36 parties. And the way they did it, as our electoral membership campaign has highlighted, was to demand a tripling of the registration requirements, which means that we would have to have provided 1,500 members to the Australian Electoral Commission in order to register. So when one looks at votes at elections, elections are a very distorted expression of the political consciousness of the working class. And one has to understand that this pandemic and what is being prepared internationally as well as in this country is an unmitigated disaster and catastrophe, which itself will change political consciousness of the working class. And that our role, our fight, is to provide that opposition which exists, which is developing in different ways and different formations with a conscious political perspective. And that's what is bound up with the fight for the development of a mass movement in defence of Julian Assange, as it is against the policies, the program, and the murderous consequences of governments in regards to the pandemic. So with those few remarks, I'll return to the, now we have so many more. That's the trouble with speaking on questions, isn't it? All more come in. So there was the issue about the Clinton's 26 emails. Does Oscar or Tom, do you want to deal with that?
Yeah, I can make a couple of brief points. And actually, there's a tie-in with the remarks you were just making about the response of the Australian political parties to Assange's arrest in April 2019. I think at the time, Labor leader Bill Shorten didn't say anything. One of those Labor MPs who did respond was Tanya Plibersek. She retweeted a tweet from a US state operative which said that Assange had worked as the agent of a proto-fascist state, Russia, to undermine democracy. The tweet branded defenders of Assange as cultists and basically revelled in the fact that he'd been brutally arrested at the British embassy, such as is the position of this senior Labor representative. I think in terms of what was revealed in 2016, it was corruption political corruption on a massive scale. WikiLeaks publications proved that the Democratic National Committee had illegally subverted its own primaries, basically rigging them to ensure that Clinton, the handpicked candidate, the banks, the intelligence agencies, was installed as Democratic presidential candidate, and not Bernie Sanders, who had raised a very limited and tepid way the issues of social inequality. The other thing that the WikiLeaks 2016 publications revealed were Clinton's secret speeches to Wall Street banks and other financial institutions. These were speeches for which she was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, and she told them on issues of banking regulation, the financial sector, I have a public position, some weasel words to contain anger over what the banks were doing, but then she has a private position, essentially that she'll do nothing to rein in the semi-criminal activities of these financial institutions. So there's no question that what WikiLeaks published in 2016 was true. It was newsworthy. It was in the public interest, which should be the essential tests for whether something is published or not. I think these slanders, lies about Russia, for which there's not a shred of evidence, are extremely discredited. The Mueller investigation, which was tasked with finding evidence of Russian interference in the 2016 election, came up with nothing, as have similar inquiries. Again, these are McCarthyite lies, which have been used to justify not only the persecution of Assange, but also a broader campaign of internet censorship, which has targeted numbers of publications, including our own, the World Socialist Web Site. I think just one other quick point, it's worth noting that Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, other supposed progressive Democrats have never challenged this McCarthyite campaign. They've never defended Assange. Like Corbyn, they might posture as opponents, as an alternative, but they're committed to the existing political setup and to displaying their fealty to the intelligence agencies, the state that's persecuting Assange. Anyway, I'll just make those points.
I think Oscar's dealt with that issue comprehensively. I wanted to move from that as an example of the many political disinformation and slander campaigns that have been waged against Assange into this question that I've seen, of course, raised in the chat about where we go from here. what we do with this information, with these facts that we're presenting. And the reason I introduce it with reference to the slander campaign, the Russian agent campaign that Oscar's spoken about, is I think before answering the question directly of what do we do, we first have to recognize that the feeling of helplessness that some people have referred to in the chat doesn't flow directly from the situation. It comes from what the political response over the Assange case has thus far made of the situation. And by changing the political response, we bring out the potential, real potential that does exist for a mass movement in Assange's defense. Assange seems isolated at the moment, and that is the real crime of what was initially done that Oscar referred to in his speech, to turn him into a pariah, to throw all of this mud on every possible question, from manufactured investigations of sexual assault to all sorts of assertions about his character. I mean, we could be here all day with me listing articles that appeared in the British media trying to present him as some sort of freak. I mean, that word was used often as a hacker, as someone with principles, a sort of criminal figure, all the rest. And the reason so much effort was put into that is because they had a real job on. They had to try and isolate someone whose work had won him incredible support in the global population, support of millions. I mean, WikiLeaks work was so significant. People speak about WikiLeaks revolutions, the events in Tunisia, which then went on to spark the Arab Spring. The major element in those were revelations of corruption carried out by WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks became synonymous, Cheryl began the meeting with this point, with opposition to war, with the truth against all of the lies that were not just told by governments, but repeated ad infinitum by the embedded journalism of the corporate media. They won a huge popular response, and the real crime that was done by that slander campaign was to begin to isolate Assange from that. But it still exists in a sort of latent sense among millions of people, and I'm sure many people in this meeting conduct an awful lot of work in support of Assange. And when you're out and speaking to people, and when you begin to sort of get it back in their minds about what WikiLeaks was, what it represented, you find a well of support, and it can be inspired in millions more of the generations, the younger generations who, you know, he's been in prison for 10 years. He's been in prison for the conscious life of millions and millions of young workers who have to have the issues explained to them. That isolation can be broken out of. The problem is the campaign for his freedom has so far been dominated by the perspective of turning to media organizations, sort of liberal human rights NGOs, to various parliamentary representatives. And that is not the route to a mass movement. The support these people offer, where they do, and it's by no means uniform, is grudging. I mean, I think everyone knows that the New York Times and the Guardian, who worked with Assange, then stabbed him in the back, and who are now formally opposed to his extradition, are doing it purely for the record. They're trying to cover for their exposure over their participation in one of the worst crimes of the 21st century. They're not interested in actually seeing him free, let alone in building a major campaign. And that extends across all of these figures. They're also completely unconnected from the broad mass of the population, from the 90% of the population, from the working class. These are not people concerned with the fate of the working class, not people concerned with the fate of its democratic rights. They're not a route to it. But that connection between Assange and the mass of the global population has to be re-established. So in addition to rejecting the turn to these forces, we have to put forward a program, an opposed program. And I think that has to be based on the understanding that, for example, a resolution passed in a workplace or in a neighborhood is worth infinitely more than a dozen editorials in the Guardian or a dozen statements in whichever parliament, motions put in parliament. I mean, they've all been done. They've all been mostly for show, and they've all gone nowhere. And they will go nowhere, because it's about what class interests are being represented. A resolution passed in a workplace is worth infinitely more. And this is the sort of action we have to turn ourselves towards in terms of concretely what people can do. I encourage everyone here, whatever country they're in, to get in touch with their local Socialist Equality Party and to engage in a discussion with us about what the potentials are in whatever situation you're in your workplace, in your local area. There's no stepping stone through the likes of a Corbyn, any particular newspaper, to the working class. You know, they are not represented by any of the forces in the political mainstream, and new leadership has to be built from the ground up. And this is the perspective that we fight for. And we are very happy, in fact, we're determined and committed to engaging in a discussion with anyone who's prepared to take up that fight, to find the best ways forward to doing so. And once that begins to get momentum in the working class and a critical mass start to understand the issues involved and start to see how closely aligned their interests are with seeing Assange free, that will transform the political situation, not just in the fight for Assange's freedom, but across a whole front of issues. We made the connection with the pandemic at the start of the meeting. And so I encourage everyone who's been fighting for the freedom of Assange for however long, now's the time to get in contact with us and start discussing about how the turn can be made to the working class, and the ways in which that can be done.
Well, I'm going to take Thomas's lead from his last comments and raise with you the issue of literature. One of the requirements of any political movement, and our movement fights for the political development of the working class, for the education of the working class, for a program which is necessary in order to take forward the interests of society, of the working class as a whole. There's numbers of comments that have been raised about is there a working class? What we've got to do is find out what the working class is. It really has disappeared. It's now everybody's middle class. In fact, the opposite is the case. The phenomena of the proletarianization of the mass of the world's population is in fact taking place on a very, very rapid scale in the poorer countries, Asia, certainly in China, in other poorer countries. In fact, those who live in the country, those who live as peasants, are being increasingly driven into the cities to work in factories, to work in workplaces in the city. In the advanced capitalist countries, those who possibly may have seen themselves as middle class professionals, in fact, they too are becoming increasingly proletarianized. The concept of what a teacher now has to perform, the workloads that are imposed upon teachers, including protecting, their little charges from infection by a virus, protecting themselves from a virus under conditions in which governments have abandoned them. There was a strike, the first strike of New South Wales teachers for 10 years that took place in December. And speaker after speaker raised that such is the situation which confronts the education system, the exodus which is now taking place amongst teachers, that in most schools, it's in some form, they don't have enough teachers to cover classes every day. I mean, this is not because you don't have people who want to teach the younger generation education. That is not why it happens, but the conditions which confront teachers is intolerable, just as the conditions which confront healthcare workers are intolerable. Doctors, junior doctors who are forced to work shift after shift, nurses who have to do the same thing, who are the lowest paid of the professions. Teachers and healthcare workers, nurses are the lowest paid of the professions. These layers, far from living the life of the sort of wealthy middle class, which is what are increasingly proletarianized. And that is what is taking place on an international scale. The working class exists. Not only does it exist, it is growing. And its opposition is growing. What it needs is a leadership. What it needs is a political perspective. And part of the fight to develop that leadership is for people in this meeting to decide to join our movement. If you agree with our political perspective and our program, then we say join. And that requires study. It is not done by just spontaneous action, protests, all of which are important, but it's done through an analysis, through political perspective. And so in one of the issues that we want to introduce to you today is our analysis. And in particular, the first, we've got two pamphlets that are a compilation of articles which have appeared on the World Socialist Web Site on the fight for the defense of Julian Assange. The first is articles from 2010 to 2016, and then the other article, the other pamphlet is up to 2018, and I think it's 2018. Now, both of those, 2018 to 2019, both of those are $5 each, and that what they do is, one, highlight the enormous analysis and perspective that we have dedicated to the fight for the defense of Julian Assange, and the connection between his defense and the development of a working class mass movement. So those are two pamphlets that we would very much encourage all those who have not yet been able to buy them to do so. They're available from mering.com.au to order, and we will post them to you as soon as possible. The next book is, as it says, the CIA Democrats, and this is articles which were developed by our comrades, by Marty McLaughlin, Patrick Martin in the United States, which is on the phenomena of the CIA Democrats, and the connection between the influx of these candidates into the Democratic Party with military intelligence background. And this was itself the development of a drastic shift to the right within the Democratic Party, and part and parcel of the anti-Russian campaign and attacking Trump and the Trump administration from the right. So I think it's these three books are very important, and they will be part of or the beginning of your library. The next book is a very important volume, and it is the first in a 7-volume series by a Russian Marxist historian, Vadim Rogovin. And this is on the history of the Soviet Union between 1922 and 1940. Its title is, Was There an Alternative? And the answer to that is yes. There was an alternative, there is an alternative, and it is Trotskyism. And what Vadim Rogovin does is, in the most painstaking way, traces the inner party struggle between 1923 and 27, which was part of the development and the consolidation of the bureaucracy, bound up with the increasing isolation of the Soviet Union after the defeat of the 1923 revolution in Germany, the defeat of the British general strike, and of course the 1927 revolution in China. It analyzes, using official documents contemporaneously, the speeches, the articles, the archival material, the memoirs. I mean, it is painstakingly compiled and developed, which outlines that not only was there an alternative, but that alternative was part of the fight for the development of the opposition to the bureaucracy, to Stalinism, to socialism in one country, and the fight for the mobilization of the Russian working class as part of the international working class against Stalinism. It, of course, raises many issues, many questions, which we can't discuss here, but it certainly is an absolutely vital publication for you to begin your developing library and analysis and knowledge of the fight for the development of the World Socialist Revolution, the party of World Socialist Revolution. Our final book and pamphlet is, in fact, the statement of principles, which is the very fundamental issues. This is a compilation of the issues that are required for joining our movement, for the development of your relationship with the Socialist Equality Party as the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. Look, I think we've got enough time for one more question to be answered. One of the points which are made is political misinformation seems to be a tactic that is being used more and more with the aim of influencing public sentiment, used effectively by Trump and clearly also in the effective vilification of Assange. The Murdoch press is guilty of preferentially shading the news to bolster the government's slant. It is time for the general public to realise they are being conned by both our leaders and the Murdoch press. This is a very serious matter and is getting worse. Look, I don't know whether Oscar or Tom want to just make a brief comment on that.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think much of that is true. I mean, what's been revealed perhaps most starkly in the Assange case is the character of the corporate press. I mean, this is not a media that informs or brings to light the truth, but one which functions as a adjunct of the state, the military, including by promoting wars, promoting the current aggression against China, and also defaming opponents of the state, such as Julian Assange. I do think one point which should be stressed is that the reason there's such a campaign for social media censorship is because broad masses of the population recognise that the corporate media is corrupt and tells lies. I think, it's easy to miss that there is a very widespread political radicalisation underway. There's immense opposition to inequality, to the pandemic policies. You just need to go on Twitter, go on Facebook. It's very clear. And these are mass social experiences through which millions of people are passing. So I think, just the last point I'd raise is that the governments that are persecuting Assange, political forces responsible for his plight, they are powerful, but they're also extremely isolated. They have no base of mass popular support, and the movement in the working class is towards the left, towards struggle. So I just echo what both Tom and Cheryl have said previously. I mean, the key issue is orienting to activating this emerging movement. And, we should be speaking in our workplaces to colleagues, explaining the relationship between the issues they confront, as nurses, teachers, whatever else, and the persecution of Assange, that this is a precedent for the suppression of their struggles, and also an attack on their right to know the truth. I think, a bold, aggressive campaign targeting the working class, raising the issue of Assange very prominently in the federal election will have a substantial impact. The issue, as we've stressed, is very much the perspective upon which this is based. We'll just make those points.
And in line with what Oscar said, political disinformation is an important issue, but not a fatal one. I mean, the famous quote is, you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And that's true. I think as far as political disinformation has an impact, it has to be understood that it rests on deeper issues of political and historical confusion. And to the degree that they're resolved and that people begin to develop a political perspective, to learn to recognize the class nature of society and the class interests that are driving political developments, to understand the history of political tendencies, where they come from, what they represent, to the degree that that process takes place, and that's what the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist Web Site in particular fights to achieve. Political disinformation starts to lose, and propaganda and all the rest starts to lose its impact. And as Oscar said, it's already, the official sort of mouthpieces are already widely discredited, and that process will be accelerated and consolidated to the degree that people begin to consciously engage in a process of political clarification.
Well, look, thank you to both Tom and Oscar. And the next issue that I want to raise, and I know it's getting late, but the issue was raised about misinformation. The question of how do we deal with misinformation? Well, one way is to read the World Socialist Web Site. It's to read the analysis of the Trotskyist movement. And for that, we need resources. The development of our website, which is the most widely read socialist website in the world, it posts 6 days a week. It covers the most broad aspects of every element of life. And it does so from the standpoint of the education of ordinary people in an accessible but Marxist analysis. And for that, we need resources, and I need to take up a collection tonight before you rush off, in order that we are able to carry this through. I mean, we are the only party that has called a meeting to discuss Julian Assange. And while there may be people who have attended who may not agree with every aspect, and that is your right, but it doesn't alter the fact that no other organisation has called such a meeting. And so I would ask you, if you're an Australian citizen, because the laws don't allow us to accept money from overseas, please make a donation and a pledge to be sent to sep.org.au/website/donate. If you're a UK citizen, please donate to wsws.org donate.en, special pages, SEP UK, donate.html. And if you're neither, please donate to the wsws.org/donate. But we need all the resources. We have no other source of political and financial support other than from our own supporters. We get no money from the state. We get no money from corporate donations or sponsorship. It is from you. And so I unabashedly ask you to donate to the World Socialist Web Site and the SEP. I would like to, however, end the meeting by thanking you for the enormous participation that has characterized this meeting. I mean, and let's say that where else can ordinary people conduct and participate in a meeting where they can have an interaction of ideas? You certainly can't do it in a trade union meeting. In trade union meetings, they close the chat down, they close the microphone down. All you can do is listen to what the union bureaucrats say. And if there are meetings where you're allowed to speak, if you disagree, you're cut out. Now, this is a meeting where you have been able to participate. It is an open forum to enable the discourse and discussion of ideas. And so the fact that you have done so with such gusto, with such enthusiasm, is really very important. And we would ask you, appeal to you to take that one step further, to take a more important step, and that is to join the Socialist Equality Party. If you agree with our program, if you agree that what is required is not just to tinker at the edges of capitalism. Capitalism is a system which now threatens the very existence of mankind, certainly through climate change, through the unbridled drive to war, which is evident in the United States, certainly supported by the Australian and government and Labor, and internationally. But it is also, in that sense, through the pandemic itself. 5 million official figures of people who have died. 1 in every 100 people over the age of 65 in the United States are dead. They are dead unnecessarily. Families in their hundreds of thousands have been affected. This is going to rip through the world, and it will be over 65s, and it will also be children. And that is the demographic, the section of the population that is now at risk. What we fight for is the development of a mass movement for a system that will protect society, that will carry through the interests of the broad sections of the working class and society as a whole. And that is a socialist society. If you agree, please join our movement on the sep.org.au/website about Get Involved. I urge you to make this decision. It will certainly be the most important decision that you make, and the most significant. But again, I thank you so much for your attendance from all over the world, for your involvement, your comments, your participation. We certainly thank Tom and Oscar for their important, decisive remarks and the answers to the question.